Prunhun Da, good afternoon everyone, Croeso, and welcome to this next in the series of Art UK Art Unlocked talks. My name's Neil Lebeter. I'm Senior Curator of Modern Contemporary Art at Ymgedfa Cymru National Museum Wales. So thank you to Art UK for inviting me to talk this evening, and we'll just get started. So Ymgedfa Cymru is a family of 7 museums sited across Wales. The art collection is housed primarily at National Museum Cardiff. And this evening I'm going to give you a bit of a virtual tour of sorts. I've picked out a few key works from the collection itself, but all of which come from a particular exhibition that we have on at National Museum Cardiff at the moment called The Rules of Art. So The Rules of Art is an exhibition that's fundamentally about showing our collection in a new way. So celebrating the art collection's strength and its breadth, but also showing it within a framework that allows discussion and questions about the collection and the societal and art historical context in which it sits, and also in which the museum sits as well. And this project came out of the museum kind of rethinking the permanent galleries in the museum, conversations that are very active at the moment and still ongoing. So there is a bit of experimentation to some elements of this exhibition, and as we'll see, some elements of experimentation in terms of the pairings that have been put together in the show. So in all, we've pulled together some 80 works from across 500 years of art history and from over a century of the museum's collecting. So creating formal and informal connections between historic and contemporary works that have never been shown together before. So some of the artists that are included include Rembrandt, Cézanne, Pablo Picasso, Gwen John, Maximilian Lentz, which is the rather large, amazing painting Spring on the right of your image there, Sylvia Goss, Millet, Francis Bacon, Claire Woods, Bob and Roberta Smith, Bedwyr Williams, and many, many more. So in order to create a thematic framework around this, this was the hardest aspect of planning the exhibition, really, and this was also the first project that I had led on since joining the museum in 2018. The art collection at the museum is large, containing over 50,000 works, covering a plethora of movements, genres and materials. So a thematically driven kind of cross-period show could go in any number of different directions. So finding something that was loose enough to provide flexibility, but with enough focus to facilitate conversation and debate was really the key thing, and probably the hardest part of the process. So we looked back to some of the founding principles of Western art as a means to showing the collection in this new way, but also to question the hierarchies within the art world and wider society that influence what artists created and what collectors and ultimately museums collected as a result for centuries, and are in a lot of ways constructions that are still being unpicked. So we settled on the hierarchy of genres. This was formalized in the 17th century by the French Academy. This kind of brought together thought that had been in Western art ever since the Renaissance, but it was the first time that it had ever been kind of formalized in such a way. And then this was adopted by art academies across Europe. So this literally ranked painting in order of importance, which went on to influence art of all genres and all mediums for hundreds of years. So in my kind of top of the pops countdown, firstly was history painting. So scenes from the Bible, mythology, national triumphs and so on were seen as the most important painting that an artist could produce, followed by portraits. Then in third, scenes of everyday life, or also known as genre scenes. In fourth place is landscape, a story that has a very particular resonance to Wales, and the kind of birth of the landscape tradition, I think, comes out of Wales and North Wales in particular. And then in last place is still life, according to the academies. So the 5 galleries of the exhibition are set out within this framework, but importantly, not in that order. We're certainly not trying to kind of reinforce that hierarchy, and also placing some of those genres together to make points around the representation of society that were kind of underpinned and reinforced by that hierarchy. So we'll come to discuss that a little bit later. So what we hope people will kind of take away from the exhibition is that visitors will see works that they are familiar with from the collection. So The Bard by Thomas Jones, which we're going to talk about first, but seeing those works in a new way. So hopefully also bridging the gap that can exist between historic and contemporary art, breaking down some of the architectural divisions that exist, particularly at National Museum Cardiff, but also lots of museums. So at our museum, we have 3 wings in which the art collection is displayed. So you have the East Wing, where historic art is shown, the centre block, where late 19th century and kind of up to mid 20th century art, and the West Wing for the last 20 years or so has shown changing contemporary art exhibitions. So this is really about kind of breaking down that structure, essentially, to show that art is a continual conversation of push and pull and not necessarily neat chronological chunks of time. And the exhibition is also about opening up questions for our audiences to run with. The show isn't designed to be prescriptive in terms of its interpretation, and it's a start of a conversation rather than the end of one, and we'll touch on that briefly at the end. And so I'm not going to attempt to cover everything here, we don't have time. Instead, I've taken 3 pairs of works from the show. I've cheated slightly by sneaking in a few others, but 6 works, the 3 pairings that make up some of the key pairings from the history painting or the history gallery. It's got more than painting in it, scenes of everyday life, and the portraiture galleries, to give you first and foremost an introduction to the exhibition and also the Amgueddfa Cymru art collection overall. So just before we jump in, just to touch on 2 works, and this is the kind of pairing that started it all off really, and was the test to see if this thematic framework of showing the collection would really work. And this is Botticelli and Studio, Virgin and Child with a Pomegranate, displayed next to Mother and Child, South Wales, by the photographer Helen Musprat. So the Botticelli work is well known to our audiences. It's been in the collection since the 1950s, I think, and is also a type of work that we kind of know well. We're kind of very familiar with this type of Christian religious painting. The work was also recently featured on the BBC's Britain's Lost Masterpieces programme, where it had its attribution quite significantly upgraded, which was very exciting. It's been conserved quite extensively since that. So this is its first showing since that discovery. So Helen Musprat, the work on the right, was one of the leading women photographers in Britain in the early 20th century. And following a trip to the Soviet Union in 1936, she travelled to the Rhondda Valley in South Wales. And her strong political beliefs are reflected in sensitive portrayals of unemployed miners and their families. So there's clearly a kind of strong visual relationship between these works that can be appreciated on its own terms, but also kind of thinking slightly deeper than that. Musprat, informally drawing on the visual language of religious art, she is exalting the lives of working people and kind of pulling out something more substantial. And you can just see, hopefully you can see from the slide, that the kind of framing of it within that informally religious setting was done after the photograph was taken. And the print is hand torn and has been hand torn by the photographer, and the poor boy on the left has been kind of cut in half so that it can be framed in this very particular way. So this acted as a template for the rest of the show. So kind of working with pairings, with groupings, even whole galleries built thematically, and working on a number of different levels, some visual, some more political, but no prescribed way or no prescribed particular messages for people to take away, and really wanting people to bring their own associations to things. And this is just a pairing of a painting by Paul Cézanne with the contemporary ceramicist Zoe Priest, which is a recent acquisition to the collection. So moving into the history gallery. So art academies in the 17th, 18th century in particular considered history painting to be the most important form of art. And this went on to influence art of all genres. So work of this type brought the most prestigious commissions, and exhibiting opportunities were available for artists really working in this way. So it was essentially in their interests to create painting in this very kind of prescribed fashion. So it fell history painting kind of fell out of favour after the Second World War, particularly when imperialism and national histories became much more contested and questioned, but notions of similarly grand themes and universal questions clearly still inspire artists today. So we come to The Bard by Thomas Jones, painted in 1774. And this is the most well-known history painting in the story of art in Wales. This recounts Edward I's fabled massacre of the Welsh bards in the 13th century. The massacre was seen as a symbolic act, an attempt to silence and suppress the very heart of Welsh culture. Rather than becoming victim to Edward's army, the last bard of Wales hurls himself off the cliffs of Snowdonia and places a curse on the king's followers. So this work is an iconic history painting in the story of art here. It has been used both to construct and to challenge notions of national identity, and has a reading of a loss of language, memory and culture. So this is a really well-known, important work in the collection. It's also very strong, it's bold. So kind of thinking about a pairing for this, and bearing in mind also that this is next to the Helen Muspratt and Botticelli work, something a bit quieter and a bit more kind of abstract, I thought would work quite well. So we selected Rachel Whiteread's Untitled History from 2002. So Whiteread's work has been described as minimalism with a heart. Her work tends to cast the negative space around objects, often those with intense personal associations such as mattresses, books, chairs, so things, domestic things that kind of often mean an awful lot to us. Her sculptures have a haunting quality that's often quite hard to kind of pin down. And many of you will know her Turner Prize winning work, House, from 1993, where an entire home was cast in this way. So an entire life essentially is, or the kind of space around an entire life. And it's really beautiful work. So Untitled History is a sculpture made of plaster, polystyrene and steel. This work was made by casting the space around a set of bookshelves. So this kind of contains everything apart from the books themselves. So leaving a space where the books were. So if you look closely at the sculpture, and I think you should be able to see this well in the image, colours from the spines and fragments of the covers of the books have left an imprint, leaving ghostly traces set starkly against the white of the material. Whiteread has created a series of these sculptures that act as a form of memorial. So the absence of the books in this work is unsettling. And if language and culture are the foundation of our shared heritage, perhaps this work, in the same way as The Bard does, hints at how easily collective memory can be lost. So we move into the next gallery, into Scenes of Everyday Life. And we took a very particular angle on the Scenes of Everyday Life section and placed it alongside portraiture. So this is the only gallery where two genres are placed side by side. And this was particularly to contrast it with 19th century academic portraiture, the type of work that we're all very familiar with and is kind of ubiquitous in most museums, to note the marked differences that existed in the representation of society through this hierarchy. So of both class and gender, rich, powerful men are overwhelmingly depicted in portraiture, which is seen as the higher form of art in the eyes of the academies, so the kind of tastemakers. And women in domestic settings performing stereotypical gender roles within the home are a common theme within genre scenes. Genre scenes is obviously a much, much broader genre than this, so but we took a very particular view of that kind of sub-genre within it. So in this section, we're asking audiences to question the female subject from the male and female perspective and ask what the differences between those things may be. So there's women subjects in all of these works, and each are taken in very different angles. And that isn't just from a contemporary viewpoint. So the painting second from the right that you can see is a painting by Emily Osborne, and she was working to draw attention to the position and the plight of women in Victorian society. So this is not a kind of just a contemporary concern. First work is Harold Gilman's The Kitchen from around 1908. And a recurring theme that characterises the art of the Camden Town group is that of women in the domestic interior, most evident in paintings by people like Walter Sickert, Gilman of course, Spencer Gore, Malcolm Drummond and William Ratcliffe. So in Gilman's painting, a lone figure is shown within the domestic space of the kitchen. And as the title suggests, Gilman has positioned the figure as indistinguishable from the kitchen itself and its role within the home. Gilman is a good example of sort of multiple narratives existing in parallel. He and the wider Camden Town group are hugely important in shaping art in Britain in the first part of the 20th century. He was also part of the Allied Artists Association, a progressive affiliation of artists that was set up to promote modernism and create an exhibiting organisation outside of the Royal Academy, much in the same way as the Impressionists had done in Paris at the end of the 19th century. However, the irony of much of the Camden Town paintings is that although women and the domestic sphere feature prominently as a subject matter, women artists were expressly denied membership of the group. And in contrast to this, Caroline Walker's Conditioning from 2019. And this is a new acquisition alongside the Zoe Priest work I showed earlier. The exhibition has a kind of core of new acquisitions that we're able to show for the first time in this exhibition, and also has work by Simon Ling and a major film piece by John Aconfra, which we'll touch on briefly at the end. So Walker's work is full of art historical references and points to the Impressionists in particular as an inspiration. And this was one of the reasons that we were really interested in Walker's work, and one of the reasons why this work was acquired. And those links, making links as it does back to the existing collection of the museum. And those of you that know the Ymgedfa Cymru collection well, we have a internationally important collection of Impressionist work that was bequeathed to the museum by the Davies sisters in the mid-20th century, and is really one of the foundational art collections of the museum. So this kind of draws kind of conversations across the decades, and acquiring kind of new work that speaks to the existing collection is really important. So, however, this is kind of crucially about subverting the male gaze that exists in much of the work of this type, so the Impressionists, but also work of the late 19th, early 20th century. So throughout her work, Walker draws attention to the hidden labour of cities, service industry workers that are in some areas overwhelmingly occupied by women and little attention paid to by wider society. She's also worked with frontline NHS workers and women working in historically male-dominated industries such as tailoring. In this series, Walker conducted walks through the city at night, so in this case London, photographing these scenes and kind of working them up through a series of sketches and oil sketches, creating these finished final works, which are kind of near life size. So when you're viewing them, there's this recurring theme of the window, the kind of frame within a frame, so you become part of the scene. And it's really kind of enveloping and really quite powerful work. And Caroline Walker's part of the current British art show that's currently touring the UK, and I think that has just opened in Wolverhampton. Moving into portraiture, and this, so we've just turned 90 degrees to our right here, we're in the same space. This gallery looks at portraits that kind of directly or indirectly push what portraiture can mean. So featuring work by Rembrandt, Bob and Roberta Smith in the centre here, Francis Bacon and Joshua Reynolds. So there's a Joshua Reynolds that would be behind you. That's a very typical Academy definition portrait from 19th century that we'd all be familiar with. Just very quickly on the David Knott interview by Bob and Roberta Smith. This is on loan from the artist. This is a really substantial work that's nearly 5 metres in height, and is a transcription of an interview that the Welsh consultant surgeon David Knott gave with Eddie Mair on the Radio 4 programme in 2014. David Knott travels to war zones and volunteers with Médecins Sans Frontières and the Red Cross and other organisations to operate on injured civilians and train local medical staff. And he's been doing this for over 30 years, I think. Knott gave this really famous and harrowing interview, having just returned from Syria, that is a famous broadcast in its own right, and I think it's still available online. But Bob and Roberta Smith was so moved by this interview that the entire interview is transcribed in this work. So while there is no physical representation here, this is nonetheless a portrait of an extraordinary contemporary Welsh figure. But one of the, or a group of works that I wanted to draw particular attention to are the crochet portraits. So the group that this painting comes from is unique. The 16 men in these little portraits all worked for Francis Crochet, an industrialist who was really close to his employees, which is very rare and unusual. And in the mid-1830s, Francis was in charge of the Hyrwine iron works and of the tin plate works at Treforest near Pontypridd, and had portraits commissioned of the people who worked there at his businesses. So this group includes workers as well as managers, and are all depicted in a landscape and in working clothes and with the tools of their trade. The pictures are believed to be painted by William Jones Chapman, a travelling portrait and sporting painter who worked mostly in Wales and the border counties. So these are thought to be the only known examples of named 19th century workers, and are really important within the collection as a result. So thinking about that kind of high academic portraiture like that of Reynolds and many other artists, which are very typical of the genre and typical of that notion of history as told from above, these portraits completely subvert that hierarchy whereby only the rich and powerful in society could have their portrait painted. These men are not rich industrialists, but the ordinary workers who drove the Industrial Revolution. One of the last works I'd like to discuss, is In the House of My Father by Donald Rodney. So from this work from 1996-97. So this is an extraordinary example of a type of contemporary self-portraiture. A photograph shows the artist's hand resting on the white sheet of a hospital bed. In his palm sits a small sculpture of a house made from his skin held together by pins. The skin was removed during treatment for sickle cell anemia, an inherited genetic condition that ultimately led to Rodney's death in 1998 at the age of 36. The house sculpture is a partner work to In the House of My Father, titled My Mother, My Father, My Sister, My Brother, which has kindly been on loan from the Donald Rodney estate to the museum for nearly 20 years. So we are able to show these two pieces side by side, as we have done in the Rules of Art exhibition. So Rodney's later work focused on his own mortality, along with a sense of family and identity. As a British-born artist whose parents had emigrated from Jamaica, Rodney explored shifting notions of Britishness and the experience of the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. This is an incredibly moving self-portrait. The work retains an ambiguous power and carries profound messages around inherited experience. So just to conclude, a final plug for the exhibition. So the Rules of Art runs until the 16th of April 2023, so you have plenty time to get yourself to Cardiff to see it. The exhibition concludes with John Akomfra's Vertigo C, film Vertigo C, which is a 3-channel video piece, which is another new acquisition to the collection that we've been able to make in partnership with Towner Art Gallery in Eastbourne. And Vertigo C kind of embodies the notion of the sublime, and we've put it in as a conclusion to the exhibition because it kind of pulls together all of the genres that exist elsewhere in the hierarchy and so much more besides. And it tells story of the transatlantic slave trade. It's looking at the whaling industry, the current refugee crisis. So it's looking back to the events of the past, but applying them to the events of now, which are important. And it's a really important work for our times. And it's a really overwhelming work that's well worth seeing. I would recommend it. Alconfar, and thank you for coming this evening. Thank you.